Right, let's dive straight into this explainer. We're not going to linger on titles here because we really need to look at the absolute state of the country's wealth right now. We're talking about a decade of sheer disenchantment for the working family.
So if you look at the GDP trajectory from 2014 straight through to 2026, the numbers are absolutely staggering. I mean, on paper, Ireland looks massive, right? We're talking top-tier European wealth that literally has foreign economists scratching their heads in pure envy. But as we unpack the data today, it becomes painfully clear that this macro-level success, well, it just isn't the daily reality for the average working family. Sure, it's grand for the multinational balance sheets, but it paints a very, very different picture down on the high street.
So you really have to ask yourself, if we're so incredibly flush with cash as a nation, why does the research show everyone feeling squeezed to the absolute limit? I mean, when you talk to people, there is this palpable sense of exhaustion. The money is definitely flowing in, but somehow it's completely bypassing the very people who are keeping the gears turning.
And that brings us to what the source material calls the great wealth illusion. Now, the illusion isn't that the wealth doesn't exist, because it absolutely does. The illusion is this outdated assumption that a rising tide automatically lifts all boats. For the past decade, despite those booming GDP numbers, the research shows that the promise of a better standard of living has just fallen severely flat for a massive chunk of the population.
We're basically looking at two Irelands right now. On one hand, you have the economy on paper. You know, the booming corporate spreadsheets, the massive export numbers, that dizzying GDP. But on the other hand, you have the economy in the pocket, and that's the drained wallet of the working family. It's a fierce divide between multinationals hoarding the gains and everyday workers just trying to make ends meet. Honestly, it's like living in two completely different countries on the exact same island.
Let's move on to wages versus rising costs, because this is exactly where normal families are really feeling the pinch. You know, we can talk macroeconomics all day long, but at the end of the week, it all comes down to what's coming in versus what's going out. And for the vast majority of people, the sums simply aren't adding up anymore.
The reality of it is stark. On one side of the equation, wage growth has essentially flatlined. A token bump here or there is absolutely nothing compared to inflation. But on the flip side, you have the skyrocketing cost of the weekly shop. Paying the gas and electricity is costing an absolute bomb just to keep the lights on. That massive gap between stagnant wages and soaring bills is exactly where Irish families are getting squeezed dry.
And honestly, you'd be hard-pressed to find a worse divide in the country right now than what's happening with housing. The chasm between those who own their homes and those who are stuck renting is creating a fundamental split in society. Listen, if you bought your house 20 years ago, fair play to you. Your mortgage is probably manageable and you've got security. But if you're part of the generation trying to get a roof over your head today, it is a completely different, totally exhausting reality.
When you compare daily life in 2014 versus 2026, the contrast in rent is just shocking. Back in 2014, a working family could reasonably rent a place without handing over their entire livelihood. Fast forward to 2026, and the figures are miles apart. Rents have absolutely skyrocketed, vastly outstripping any sort of wage growth. The research points out how incredibly hard it is to save for a deposit when a massive chunk of your hard-earned cash just vanishes on the first of the month.
Think about it this way. Before a young working family has even bought a loaf of bread, paid for childcare, or put a single euro into savings, a massive portion of their take-home pay is instantly devoured by housing and transport. It leaves young families totally trapped in this exhausting cycle, literally running on a treadmill just to stand still.
And to be fair, let's say you are somehow getting by in the private sector. Let's say you've actually managed the rent and the groceries. You're still dealing with straining public services every single day, because no matter what you earn, you rely on the exact same roads, trains, and hospitals as everyone else. And the system, well, it's visibly creaking.
People are rightly giving out, and the research shows exactly why. Despite all the global GDP bragging rights, the daily reality is failing transport, overwhelmed infrastructure, and crumbling support systems. You're standing in the lashing rain waiting for a bus that never shows up, or you're stuck on a waiting list for months on end. Public services are buckling, which leaves everyone wondering how a supposedly rich country can feel so poorly resourced on the ground.
All of this disconnect between the paper wealth we see on the news and the pocket reality we feel at the checkout brings us to what the data calls a decade of pure disenchantment. It is not just a passing phase, you know, it is a deeply rooted frustration. The promise was that economic growth would make things better, and it did, but seemingly only for a select few.
Tracking from 2014 to 2026, national optimism effectively dropped off a cliff. Back in 2014, there was hope, a feeling that we were finally pulling ourselves out of the muck. But as the years rolled on and pressures rose with the housing crisis and the insane cost of living, that optimism just plunged. As the squeeze got tighter, belief in a fairer future completely evaporated for the working family.
The source material sums this up perfectly with the phrase, declining optimism and feeling economically trapped despite GDP growth. That word, right there, trapped, is the core issue. You have an entire demographic of workers who are doing absolutely everything right, yet they genuinely feel economically boxed in, with no clear way out.
Which leaves the analysis with one final, massive question for the future of Ireland. If the phenomenal wealth being generated on this island isn't translating into affordable housing, functional transport, and a decent standard of living for the people who actually live here, who exactly is this economy meant to serve? Thanks for joining me to unpack this explainer today, and I'll leave you to ponder that one.